September 15, 1940. 11:47 in the morning, 22,000 feet above the Kent countryside, Pilot Officer Colin Gray had a Messerschmitt Bf 109 dead in his sights. 400 yards, closing fast. The German pilot hadn't seen him yet. Gray's thumb hovered over the firing button. 3 seconds to kill range. The Messer's nose dropped into a steep dive. Gray followed, pushed his stick forward, felt the negative G lift him against his harness straps. His Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed once and died. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. The gun sight drifted off target. 1,030 horsepower, gone in an instant. Gray cursed. He knew exactly what had happened. Every RAF pilot knew. The carburetor had flooded. The engine had starved for 2 seconds, maybe 3. His Spitfire was a glider below him. The Messerschmitt pulled out of its dive and vanished into the clouds. The German pilot didn't even look back. He didn't need to. He knew the British couldn't follow. Gray's engine restarted with a rough cough. His 5th kill had escaped, not because of German skill, but because of British engineering. He landed at Big and Hill 20 minutes later, filled out the same maintenance report he'd filed twice before. Engine cut out during negative G maneuver. Duration 2.3 seconds. Enemy aircraft escaped. The report would join 2,300 others in a filing cabinet at the Air Ministry. 2,300 documented engine failures during the Battle of Britain alone. 2,300 moments when British pilots were helpless in the sky. Somewhere in that stack of reports was the answer to why so many young men weren't coming home. But finding the answer wasn't the problem. The problem was that nobody could fix it. Nobody except a woman working alone in a laboratory at Farnborough. A woman most of the RAF had never heard of. Her name was Beatrice Schilling, and she was about to break every rule in the Air Ministry to save their lives. The flaw was simple. The consequences were brutal. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the heart of every Spitfire and Hurricane, used an SU carburetor with a float chamber. During normal flight, gravity pulled fuel down into the engine. The system worked perfectly, but combat wasn't normal flight. When a pilot pushed into a dive, negative G forces threw everything upward, including the fuel. The fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The float dropped to the bottom. The valve opened wide. Fuel flooded the system and drowned the supercharger. The engine died 1 second, sometimes 2. Sometimes long enough for a messmate to circle back and put cannon shells through your cockpit. The Germans had no such problem. Their Daimler-Benz DB601 engine used direct fuel injection, no float chamber, no flooding. A Bf 109 pilot could roll inverted, dive vertical, pull negative G for 10 seconds straight. His engine never missed a heartbeat. Luftwaffe tacticians had figured this out within weeks of the first engagements. Their solution was elegant. When a British fighter gets on your tail, dive. The Spitfire will follow. Its engine will cut out. You escape or you turn and kill him while he's helpless. They called it the English disease. They exploited it in every single dogfight. Fighter Command knew about the problem. They'd known since 1937. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had written reports, filed recommendations, proposed modifications. Nothing happened. The Air Ministry had other priorities, production schedules, budget debates, arguments about whether the problem was really as serious as the engineers claimed. Then came the Battle of Britain. Between July and October 1940, RAF pilots documented engine cutouts in 43% of diving attacks. 43%. Nearly half of every aggressive maneuver ended with a dead engine. Squadron commanders estimated 80 to 100 pilot deaths were directly caused by the carburetor flaw. Men who had Germans in their sights. Men who did everything right. Men who died because their engines betrayed them at the worst possible moment. Rolls-Royce was working on a solution. A pressure carburetor. Complete redesign of the fuel system using injection principles similar to German engines. Estimated completion, late 1943. The RAF couldn't wait 3 years. They were losing pilots faster than they could train replacements. Every week, experienced men were dying because of a float chamber designed for peacetime flying. The file landed on Beatrice Schilling's desk in November 1940. Principal Technical Officer, Carburetor Research and Development. The only female engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She read the combat reports. She studied the maintenance logs. She interviewed pilots who'd survived engine failures. She understood the problem within a week. Solving it would take her 4 months. Testing it would risk her entire career. If you want to see how one woman's simple invention saved thousands of RAF pilots, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Schilling. Schilling wasn't supposed to be an engineer. She was born in 1909 in Waterville, a small town in Hampshire. Her father was a butcher. Girls from families like hers became secretaries or nurses or shopkeepers. Schilling had other plans. At 14, she bought a broken motorcycle with money saved from odd jobs. Her parents thought she wanted to ride it. She wanted to understand it. She stripped the engine down to its smallest components, learned what each part did, rebuilt it on her bedroom floor better than it was before. At 25, she raced that motorcycle at Brooklyn's 106 miles per hour around the concrete banking. She earned the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, one of only 3 women in history to receive it. Racing taught her something textbooks couldn't: how engines behaved under stress, when they failed, why they failed, how to feel a problem before the gauges showed it. Now she was the RAF's carburetor specialist, and their carburetors were killing pilots. The solution came to her in January 1941. Simple physics. If the problem was too much fuel during negative G, restrict the fuel flow. Not completely, just enough to prevent flooding. The engine would still get what it needed, just not enough to drown. A brass disc with a hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Size the hole to allow exactly enough fuel for maximum power and nothing more. She machined the first prototype herself, tested 17 different hole sizes, ran simulations for 6 weeks. The optimal diameter, 0.04 inches. Bench tests were perfect. Engine cutouts dropped from 2 seconds to a fraction of a heartbeat, too brief to matter in combat. But bench tests weren't combat. Schilling needed to test it in an actual dogfight. The problem was authorization. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF aircraft was a court-martial offense. The Air Ministry required 6 months of testing, review committees, safety certifications, paperwork that would take longer to complete than pilots had left to live. Schilling had 6 brass restrictors and a decision to make. She could wait for authorization, follow procedure, do everything by the book, or she could save lives now and face the consequences later. On March 17, 1941, she loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and restrictors, rode 40 meters through the English countryside to RAF Big and Hill. The morning patrols were being prepared. Ground crews swarmed over Spitfires and Hurricanes, checking engines, loading ammunition. Schilling found the chief mechanic, a sergeant named Harris, who'd been maintaining Merlin engines since before the war. 16 years of experience, hands that knew every bolt and wire in the Merlin by touch. She showed him the brass disc, explained the physics, told him she needed to install it in an aircraft without authorization, without paperwork, without anyone in command knowing. Harris turned the restrictor over in his oil-stained fingers. Such a small thing, such a simple thing. "How do you know it works?" he asked. "Bench tests, 6 weeks of them. Perfect results every time." "Bench tests aren't combat." "I know. That's why I'm here." Harris looked at the Spitfires on the flight line. Young pilots climbing into cockpits. Young men who trusted their engines to keep them alive. "I've lost 11 pilots to engine cutouts," he said quietly. 11 good men. Peterson Williams, that Scottish lad, M'Leod couldn't have been more than 20 years old. He looked at Schilling, looked at the restrictor in his hand. "If this thing works, I don't care if the king himself hasn't authorized it." He picked up his welding kit and walked toward the nearest Spitfire. Flight Lieutenant Al Deere was one of the most experienced pilots in Fighter Command. New Zealander, 54 combat missions, 7 confirmed kills. He'd been shot down twice, survived a mid-air collision, walked away from a crash landing that should have killed him. He'd also reported engine failure 4 times, all during diving attacks, all in the last 3 months. On March 17th, his Spitfire was the first aircraft fitted with Schilling's restrictor. He didn't know it. Nobody told him. If the modification failed, Schilling wanted the blame to fall on her, not on a pilot who'd had no choice in the matter. Harris welded the restrictor into the fuel line in less than 2 minutes. He wasn't invisible, but it was no invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Deere climbed into the cockpit at 07:15, standard morning patrol, 2 hours over the channel watching for German formations. Schilling stood at the edge of the airfield. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were still. If the restrictor worked, Deere would never notice anything different. If it failed, if it starved the engine, if the weld cracked, if the hole was the wrong size, Deere would fall out of the sky, and Schilling would spend the rest of her life knowing she'd killed him. The Spitfire's Merlin roared to life. Deere taxied to the runway, released brakes, accelerated, lifted off. Schilling watched him climb until the Spitfire was a speck against the grey English sky. Then she waited. The minutes crawled past. Each one felt like an hour. She paced the edge of the airfield, checked her watch obsessively, calculated fuel consumption in her head. 2 hours of patrol, maybe 2.5 if Deere extended. Ground crews moved around her. Mechanics worked on other aircraft. The war continued as if nothing unusual was happening. For them, nothing was. For Schilling, everything was. She'd tested engine modifications before, published papers, attended conferences, but she'd never gambled a man's life on her work. Never sent someone into combat with a piece of equipment that existed only because she believed it would work. Belief wasn't proof, and if she was wrong, belief wouldn't bring Deere back. Harris found her at the 1-hour mark, brought her a cup of tea. She took it but didn't drink. Her stomach was too knotted for tea. "He's a good pilot," Harris said. "Best in the squadron. If anyone can test your gadget properly, it's him." Schilling nodded. She'd chosen Deere for exactly that reason. Experienced, aggressive, the kind of pilot who'd push into a dive without hesitation. The kind of pilot who'd find out fast whether the restrictor worked or didn't. 90 minutes. The patrol should be ending soon. Deere would be turning back toward Big and Hill. If everything had gone normally, if his engine hadn't failed over the channel, if he wasn't floating in a life jacket right now, watching his Spitfire sink into the cold, grey water. If he wasn't already dead. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, Deere's Spitfire appeared over the airfield. Schilling saw it first. She'd been watching the sky so long, her eyes ached. One aircraft, no smoke, no damage. Deere landed smoothly, taxied to dispersal, cut his engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. He was grinning. Pilots didn't grin after routine patrols. They looked tired, tense, relieved to be alive. Deere looked like a man who'd just discovered a secret. Harris reached him first. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Deere pulled off his helmet. Problems? That was the best the Merlin ever run. He'd encountered 2 Bf-109s over the channel. They'd spotted him, turned to engage, then dove when he got behind them. The standard German escape tactic. Deere had followed. Full negative G, stick pushed forward. The dive that should have killed his engine. The Merlin never stuttered. Full power through the entire maneuver. Deere had closed to 150 yards before the German pilots realized something was wrong. He'd hit one of them, watched pieces fly off the Messer's tail. The German had limped toward France, trailing smoke. First confirmed damage Deere had scored in a diving attack since August. "I don't know what maintenance did to this aircraft," Deere said, "but I want it done to every Spitfire in the squadron." Harris looked at Schilling. Schilling looked at the ground. "I think that can be arranged, sir," Harris said. Word spread through Fighter Command like wildfire. Big and Hill installed restrictors in every aircraft within 48 hours. Pilots reported flawless engine performance. Diving attacks that would have ended in failure now ended in kills. Squadron commanders from Hornchurch called from Kenley, from Tangmere and Northolt and Manston. What did Big and Hill do to their engines? How do we get it? The Air Ministry found out within a week. Schilling expected fury. She expected court-martial threats. She expected her career to end. Instead, she got a phone call. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of 11 Group, the man responsible for every fighter squadron defending London and southeast England. "Miss Schilling," he said, "I've just read the combat reports from Big and Hill. I'm told you're responsible." Schilling braced herself. "Yes, sir. How fast can you install this device in every aircraft in Fighter Command?" Schilling blinked. "Sir, you heard me. How fast?" She did the math in her head. 43 stations, 3,000 engines. If she trained installation teams at each base, worked around the clock, prioritized frontline squadrons. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 5 if Rolls-Royce can manufacture the restrictors fast enough. "You have 4, Park said. "I'll handle the authorization. You handle the installation. Don't let me down." Schilling assembled a team of 3 engineers and rode her Norton to every fighter station in southern England. Big and Hill was just the beginning. Then Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, Northolt, Manston, Hawking, Gravesend, Cudden. 43 stations in 4 weeks. She plotted her route like a military campaign, hit the frontline squadrons first, work outward from there. She trained ground crews personally, demonstrated the installation procedure, supervised the first fittings at each base, checked every weld, measured every hole diameter, rejected any restrictor that didn't meet her specifications. She slept in hangars when there was time to sleep, ate sandwiches on her motorcycle when there wasn't, rode through spring rain and occasional German bombs. Some stations welcomed her. The pilots at Hornchurch lined up to shake her hand after their first successful diving attacks with the restrictor. Others didn't know what to make of her. A woman giving orders to their mechanic. A civilian telling RAF personnel how to modify their aircraft. At one station, a wing commander refused to authorize the installation, told her to come back when she had proper paperwork from the Air Ministry. Schilling pulled out Air Vice Marshal Park's direct authorization. The wing commander went pale. The installation proceeded without further objection. At another station, a young pilot asked her what she'd done to deserve such an important job. "I'm good at it," she said simply. He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. Fair enough. By April 20th, every Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had a restrictor fitted. 2,847 Merlin engines, 4 weeks of non-stop work. The device needed an official name. The RAE called it the RAE restrictor. The pilots called it something else. Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, gave it the nickname that stuck: Miss Schilling's Orifice. Crude RAF humour. Schilling didn't mind. If a dirty joke helped pilots remember who'd saved them, she'd take it. The results were immediate and undeniable. Fighter Command tracked every statistic, every engagement, every kill, every loss. March 1941, before the restrictor engine cutouts in 41% of diving attacks. Kill-to-loss ratio 1.4 to 1. 51 British fighters lost, 73 German aircraft destroyed. April 1941, after the restrictor engine cutouts in 3% of diving attacks, kill-to-loss ratio 3.1 to 1. 27 British fighters lost, 84 German aircraft destroyed. The transformation was immediate, measurable, undeniable. Pilot confidence changed overnight. Men who'd hesitated to commit to dives now pressed their attacks without a second thought. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's top aces, described the change in a letter to his family. "It's like flying a different aircraft. Before, every dive was a gamble. Would the engine keep running or wouldn't it? You'd hesitate for just a moment, and that moment could kill you. Now there's no hesitation. The Merlin runs perfectly. No matter what I do, I can fight the way I've always wanted to fight." Flying officer Johnny Johnson, who would become the RAF's top-scoring ace, flew his first combat missions in April. The older pilots told me about the engine failures, Johnson recalled years later. They said you had to be careful in a dive. Your Merlin might quit on you. By the time I started flying combat, that problem was gone. Miss Schilling had fixed it. I never thought twice about diving on a German. That probably saved my life a dozen times. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the legendary pilot who flew with 2 artificial legs, credited the restrictor with changing his tactics completely. Before Schilling, we fought defensively. We were afraid of our own engines. After Schilling, we fought the way fighter pilots are supposed to fight. Aggressive, committed, no hesitation. She gave us our confidence back. Pilot officer Al Deer, the same man who'd unknowingly tested the first restrictor, became one of its most vocal advocates. I didn't know I was the guinea pig until weeks later, Deer wrote in his memoirs. When Miss Schilling told me what she'd done, I wasn't angry. I was grateful. She took a risk on me so that thousands of other pilots wouldn't have to take the same risk. That takes courage. Luftwaffe intelligence noticed the change within weeks, after action reports from April mentioned that British fighters were no longer breaking off diving attacks. The tactical advantage had evaporated. By May 1941, German tactical manuals had quietly removed the section about exploiting British engine failures. The English disease had been cured by a woman with a brass washer and the courage to break the rules. The restrictor remained in service until 1943. Rolls-Royce finally delivered the pressure carburetor that year. The proper engineering solution: fuel injection principles, no float chamber, no flooding. But converting existing aircraft took 8 hours per engine. Fighter Command couldn't ground its squadrons that long, so the restrictors stayed. Many aircraft flew with Miss Schilling's orifice until 1944, some until the end of the war. Pilots trusted it. Ground crews knew how to install it. The device cost less than £1 to manufacture. A brass washer keeping pilots alive for 4 years. Schilling didn't stop working after the restrictor. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had endless problems. Each one could kill pilots. Each one needed a solution. She developed cold start modifications for Spitfires deployed to Russia. Arctic temperatures in Murman dropped to -40 degrees. Fuel lines froze solid. Batteries died within hours. Engine oil turned to thick sludge. British pilots couldn't start their aircraft. Soviet ground crews had never seen a Merlin engine before. Schilling designed a cold start procedure using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures. She wrote a manual simple enough for Russian mechanics to follow. Spitfires flew combat missions over Murman through the brutal winter of N. She researched high-altitude performance. Late-war Spitfires flew at 35,000 feet, chasing German reconnaissance aircraft and high-altitude bombers. At that altitude, the air was thin. Oxygen was scarce. Fuel mixture had to be precisely calibrated. Too rich, and the engine flooded. Too lean, and it overheated. Schilling developed altitude-compensating modifications that improved power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Test pilots reported better climb rates, better maneuverability, better chances of catching Germans who thought they were safe at high altitude. By 1945, she'd completed 17 major projects at Farnborough: cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, supercharger efficiency. Each project saved lives. None achieved the fame of the restrictor. She married George Naylor in 1938, a mathematician at the RAE, who later flew bombers with 625 Squadron, 31 missions over Germany. Distinguished Flying Cross. Bomber Command had the highest casualty rate of any RAF branch. 1 in 2 didn't survive the war. Every time Naylor took off, the odds said he might not come back. Schilling understood those odds better than most. She'd calculated probability for a living. She knew exactly how thin the margin was between life and death at 20,000 feet over Germany. Naylor beat the odds, came home in 1944. They never talked about what he'd seen. He never asked about her work. Some things are better left in silence. In 1948, King George V appointed Schilling an officer of the Order of the British Empire. She went to Buckingham Palace, received the medal, posed for photographs with the king. A reporter asked her what the secret to her success was. "Solving problems," she said. "That's all engineering is." Someone has a problem. You find a solution. You make it work. The reporter asked if being a woman had made her career more difficult. Schilling shrugged. I didn't have time to think about being a woman. I was too busy being an engineer. The next morning, she was back at Farnborough, working on jet engine problems. She never reached director-level positions. Those were reserved for men, unwritten rules that no one acknowledged, but everyone followed. She never complained publicly. She preferred real engineering to paperwork. Anyway, after the war, she worked on the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile. Researched wet runway breaking landing accidents were killing more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. She published 3 technical papers on how water on runways affected tire friction, dry physics that saved wet landings. She helped design a bobsled for the RAF Olympic team. Strange project for an aeronautical engineer. But bobsled design involved the same principles she'd mastered: aerodynamics, weight distribution, friction management. The team used her design in competition. They didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. In bobsledding, that counts as success. In 1967, Dan Gurney's Eagle Mk1 Formula One car had an overheating problem that his team of engineers couldn't solve. Someone suggested calling the old lady who'd fixed the Spitfires during the war. Schilling was 58 years old. She looked at the cooling system for 2 hours, asked questions, took measurements, made calculations. Then she found the solution. Engineers half her age, with degrees from the best universities, couldn't fix what she solved in an afternoon. It's the same as any other engine problem, she told the team. You understand the physics, you find the simplest solution, you make it work. She retired in 1969. Spent her final years the way she'd spent her first years, working on motorcycles, restoring vintage machines, racing at classic events, maintaining the Norton she'd owned since she was 14, the motorcycle that had taught her how engines behaved under stress. She died on November 18, 1990, age 81. The obituaries focused on one thing: the brass washer, Miss Schilling's orifice. Everything else was footnotes. Today, a pub in Farnborough is named the Tilly Schilling. The Brooklands Museum displays her racing trophies. Universities have buildings bearing her name. Engineering schools teach the restrictor as a case study. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results. But the real lesson isn't about engineering, it's about courage. In March 1941, Beatrice Schilling had a choice. She could follow procedure, wait for authorization, file paperwork, and attend committee meetings while pilots died. Or she could load a motorcycle with brass washers and fix the problem herself. She chose to act. She risked her career, her reputation, maybe her freedom. She installed an unauthorized modification in a combat aircraft and sent a pilot into battle without telling him. If she'd been wrong, she'd have been court-martialed, imprisoned, destroyed. She wasn't wrong. Thousands of pilots came home because of what she did. Thousands of families stayed whole. Thousands of futures were lived instead of buried in military cemeteries. One woman, one motorcycle, one brass washer with a hole in it, and the courage to act when everyone else was waiting for permission. That's how you change history. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten heroes from history every week. Real people, real courage. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Beatrice Schilling. She saved thousands of lives, and almost nobody knows her name. Until